We're starting so late, I won't do a song today. We'll just go ahead and go into it. We'll see if we get more stragglers in. I can redo parts of this anyway, because the next piece that we're going to look at, if you notice, you know, there is always a madness or a practice in my madness. The first 4 sessions, we basically looked at, you know, the forms of Hebrew poetry. We looked at the early poems. We looked at how to look at the poems, how to look at the Psalms so that you can understand where they're from and their time periods, etc., etc. We talked about subscriptions, which are a critical aspect in not understanding the Psalms, but noting that the subscriptions were added well after the Psalms were written and after the period of which the Psalms were even compiled together. So, you know, with that information, I think we have enough information now to be able to understand something about the Psalms themselves and how that we can not only understand, you know, their meaning, and I don't like to use the word interpretation. This isn't about interpretation. You know, people get a really funny thing about interpretive stuff. For example, I will argue all day that you can't interpret Greek. Greek is so concrete, there isn't room for interpretation. Now, you'll find some passages that are a little bit difficult to understand, a little bit difficult to reconcile historically, but once you understand the historicity of them, then you understand the passage. Hebrew is much different than that, and that's what I've been trying to convey to you. If you didn't notice, look, to us, numerals are cut and dry, right? I mean, not only are they cut and dried, what do we teach? Well, ineffectively teach people in our school systems, right? Mathematics, I wish we taught it better. We could have a whole culture of mathematicians, because math ain't difficult, guys. But we make it difficult, but yet within our, okay. There are those who are math aware. Remember, there's 3 types of people in the world, those who are math able and those who are not. Right? My point is simply this. For all of those who think they're not math capable, or think they have some math issues, right? Now, take that to the Hebrew culture, where you don't have base 10, you don't have numerals, you don't even, it's very difficult to even understand what they are. Do you think they had fractions? They had no idea what a fraction was. Someone asked me, and I think it was really appropriate, you know, for example, you asked how they do the tithe. It tells you in Exodus and Leviticus how to do the tithe. You take your animals and you take a rod. The animals walk under the rod. Every 10th animal goes to the tithe. Do you have to do any mathematics for that? No. None at all. I don't have to count. Well, I count to 10. I can do that. See? The thing is that we need to understand culturally that, for example, numerals, numbers, time. Remember I showed you on the board, I put the outline and showed you when time came about in terms of culture and history. Time wasn't even on the, you know, the idea of the hours was barely there when the children of Israel went on the Exodus. There's no minutes and seconds until, around 300 BC. We think that money is ubiquitous. Money is ubiquitous to us. We give our children pennies. Well, they're not worth anything, but we give them pennies, right? Money was not created until 600 BC. There's no money in the Old Testament era. There's no money in the Psalms. There's not, okay, even beyond that. There is no inkling of money in the Old Testament. There is no conception of money in the Psalms. So, these, and I really want to emphasize, these aren't, okay, we've already looked at some very complex Psalms. Are these stupid people? These people are incredibly intelligent. so intelligent that they base their poetry on an intellectual idea. Not rhythm, not rhyme, not glottal stops, but on intellect. So you see parallelism. Parallelism isn't something you gather from the rhythm of the psalm, of the poetry. It's not something that you gain from the rhyme structure. So, you know, I just can't emphasize this more. These are not unintelligent. They're not people that are not cogent or cognizant of the world around them. They're very understanding the world around them. They don't have the tools that we have that enables them to look at the world in the way we look at the world. They don't have numbers like we have numbers. They can't count the way we count. Their idea of time is very different than our idea of time. Their viewpoint of the world is many times different than our viewpoint of the world. And over that whole covering is also the problem that they don't have, or they do have in Hebrew culture. They have an incredibly euphemistic language. So euphemistic. You're going to see, we're going to look at the 113th Psalm today. I want to go, the three things I want to achieve today. Number one, I want to look back at the 90th Psalm and kind of complete that, because I kind of shorted you on that. And it's a very, very important psalm. I want you to see the in conclusion portions of that. I want to get into the 113th Psalm because that is the beginning of the Hallel. And so, as I said, we've moved from basically getting the basic tools or the basic understanding of the Psalms, of what they are and how they're put together, etc., to the use of the Psalms in worship. Because you can't disconnect them. It's impossible to disconnect the Psalms from the idea of worship. That's historical. That's not theological. The Psalm, why do you think the Psalms were written?
To be used in
Worship.
The only reason the Psalms were written is to be used in praise, in worship. You could ask the same question of this. Why was the Odyssey and the Iliad written? Or better yet, why was it composed?
Honor.
What's that?
To honor the folks that went on the Odyssey.
Well, it kind of does and it kind of doesn't. Okay, those who have really studied the Odyssey and the Iliad, is the Odyssey and the Iliad in honor of the guys that fought in the Trojan War? Is the Odyssey, even easier, is the Odyssey a positive thing about Odysseus? No. It's negative. It's the most negative thing you could imagine. Here's a guy, gets lost. Okay. The rulers of the Aegean, Greeks, he gets lost. I mean, I know it happened all the time, right? But do you tell people this happens? Look, we got lost sailing, and we're the expert sailors in the whole of the Mediterranean.
He was just a guy. She just stopped and asked for directions.
Well, he did, but every time he did, look what happened. Circe, she wasn't giving directions. She was like keeping them for pets, literally, right? And the lotus eaters, and, you know, going through the crashing rocks, you know, and what is...
No wonder why men don't ask directions.
That's right.
Look what happened.
Look what could happen. You know? We learned this early, right?
Back to his point, an honor doesn't necessarily mean that it's a positive story. The fact that story was honored of those people because it was written down, because it told the story, because that's an honor in itself.
Well, it is to us.
Isn't
but
it more about
not
the
to them.
gods than about the people?
You're exactly right. What the Odyssey and the Iliad is about is not about the people. It's about the actions of the gods among the Greeks. And the thing is that it's not supposed to honor Odysseus. Odysseus the idiot, who leaves his beautiful wife, who's being, in his beautiful palace, and she's being courted by all these guys, and he has to come home and kill them all, right? And if you want to know about courtship in Greece, read my book. Courtship in Greece is an ugly thing. But in any case, it's because it's not about Odysseus. It's not about the Greeks who fought the Trojan War. It is about the gods. Look at ancient literature. Let's look back at, for example, Beowulf. What is Beowulf about? What are all the sagas about? The sagas basically are about demigods. Demigods, humans that are fighting against the forces of the gods of evil in the world. That's what almost all the Anglo-Saxon stuff is pretty interesting. Greek's pretty straightforward. Now think about this. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Judges, Joshua, Judges. What are those all about? The history of what?
Israel and their relationship with God.
It's basically the revelation of God in the history of Israel, right? It's not, is it about Joshua? Is it about Moses?
A little.
Well,
They're
they're
players, but, it's how God is directing his people.
right. I mean, Moses isn't the hero of Genesis, right? He ain't even there. See? The point is this. All ancient literature is about the action of God or gods in the world. The level of difference that you get, for example, now we go to history. Herodotus and, who's the other guy? Theodocles. And Theodocles wrote the earliest histories that we have. They're Greeks. The point of the histories was, what were the histories not about? About the gods. Now, they still, for example, you read Herodotus, you look at Theodocles. Theodocles is the guy who wrote about, and I hope I got it right, but yeah, I think I got it right. Theodocles is the guy who wrote about the, remember the 300? Actually, there were 1,300. There were 1,000, I think, Macedonians along with him, but the Macedonians didn't count because the guy who wrote it was a Spartan. But in any case, hated Macedonians. But the big deal is this. Within it, you see the culture of the Greeks being played out, because before they ever did a battle, what did Greeks do? What did everyone do before they went to battle?
Sacrifice.
They sacrificed. The Hebrews did it. The Egyptians did it. The Greeks did it. Everyone before they went to battle sacrificed. And so their sacrifices were basically actions to see what the gods, what portended. They tried to predict the future through them. And so in the book about, in, I can't remember what he called it, but Theodocles' chronicles about the battle of Thermopylae? No, it wasn't Thermopylae. Battle of where? What's the little? Is it
Pass where they held off.
The pass.
Yeah, where they held off the 300 people. Thermopylae or something like that.
Thermopylae, anyway. Where I'm trying to cite anecdotal instance or instance from history so that we can see the picture of this. But in writing about it, he wrote about the sacrifices they made to the gods, but he didn't write about what?
God's taking part in the battle.
The gods taking part in it. See, the Old Testament, almost not uniquely, is about the action of God, Yahweh, being revealed within the history of the people of Israel. Now, what is unique about the Old Testament documents? Just so we get a kind of a straight skinny on this. What's unique? The Greeks recognize it. Right? Most of the Romans recognize it, Greeks recognize it, almost all the ancient world recognizes.
Monotheism?
What's that?
Monotheism?
Well, monotheism is a characteristic of Old Testament documents, but there's something else that's really important in it. For example, what we see in Greek literature, for example, is we see a mythos structure. So, you know, within the development of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, there are many incidents that we would consider pure mythos, pure myth. Circe's, right? Some of the myth can be resolved. I mean, for example, the Lotus Eaters. Okay, people that get drugged out, right? Who knows who they were? I don't know. The Amazons. There supposedly is a group of matriarchal tribe that the Greeks knew in Scythia, I believe, that were supposed to have women warriors. Haven't found much evidence for them, you know, in archaeology and history, but you know, they're supposed to exist. So that's not necessarily myth. But how about centaurs? Right? Centaurs and Medusas and hydras. Do we see any of that in the Old Testament?
No.
You don't see any of that in the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, the closest you get in the Old Testament is you get some prophetic stuff with things about angels and description of angels. But those angels are what? They're always, you see a hierarchy that's very interesting, because it's not like the humans are fighting demons that are actually wandering around. The demons have a spiritual character, and by the way, are there any demons really in the Old Testament? Not really. You know, you don't really encounter demons until you get where? New Testament, and why is that?
Jesus casting out.
Well, the difference is Greek. These guys in the New Testament era are Greek culturally. They've accepted the Greek cultural views, and so the Greek culture is now imposed on, as opposed to the Old Testament culture. And this is something that is acknowledged by the ancient Greeks, acknowledged by a lot of ancient cultures that were familiar with the Hebrew culture. That the Hebrew culture was focused in history, and that the way their God interacted was very different than the way that other gods interacted. And this is in spite of the fact that, what do we know about Abraham? Was Abraham a pagan? Someone mentioned to me the potential that he was a moon worshiper because he came from Ur. Well, remember what I told you. We can tell by the way that we do the days of the week. We can tell by the way that we monitor the sun, right? Where did the idea of keeping time for the day come from? Egyptians. Because what do they worship? Ra, right? The Hebrews did do lunar, but you notice what we found. I showed you all the early stuff. Remember the early stuff? And they were distinctly missing what? Lunar. Even weeks weren't in their account, which I thought was kind of odd. But I'll talk more about this. We're going to get more into this. The thing I want to start with is this, and I gave you a touch because we're going to get more into this. But if you look at the sheet of information, okay, as we transition, let's look at, for example, this is the use in Jewish practice of the Psalms. If you look, this is a schedule, and I think did I take off? No, I didn't. I even left on the modern ones, okay? So you have to pick and choose. That's okay. I'll help you with that. But Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, that is one of the required festivals. This is last year, so September 19th, just kind of give you an idea. These are in order. So Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. That was the 20th of September, which goes into Sukkot. Sukkot is the festival of booths. It says huts, which is about right. You built a hut, you lived for a week in the hut until the last day of Sukkot, which is the day of basically absolution. They've got the 8th day of assembly. These are more modern. The Rejoicing of the Torah is modern. The Hanukkah, Festival of Lights. The New Year for Trees is an old, very old, but it's not one of the main. There's 6 main festivals that are in the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and then there are the other ones. For example, the New Year for Trees, Purim, comes from Esther. Then there's Pesach. Pesach is the Passover. The Holocaust Remembrance Day is a modern one. The Israel Independence Day is modern. The Counting of the Omer, that is one of the festival harvest things. Jerusalem Day is in modern. Shavuot is Festival of Weeks, that's ancient. And the Tisha, the fast of Av, is a old one. That's one of the added ones. But look at, very interesting, because the New Year for Trees, all the harvest festivals probably came out of the Canaanite process. So, in other words, when they took over Canaan, right, when they took over the land, what did they also assimilate?
Well, some of their culture.
Well, we know this, right? Because why did they blame the diaspora? They blamed the diaspora on the fact that they had married, they had accepted the practice, and they did. The proof is right here. As a matter of fact, although Purim has a very interesting, where it came from, where did it come from? It came from Esther. And although it was a rescuing of the people, of the Hebrew people, it happened in Persia, Babylon, basically, right? Persia. And then you get the Festival of Lights, Hanukkah. You wouldn't know about Hanukkah except if you study the Apocrypha, right? Because it comes out of Maccabees. So Hanukkah is when the temple was retaken after the abomination of desolation had occurred, and they retook and cleansed the temple, and they could only find 1 day's worth of oil that was consecrated, but the oil lasted for 7 days, and so that's the 7 days of Hanukkah. I didn't, and I should. What I should probably do is do the overlay of all of these with our calendar. Because what is our Rosh Hashanah? What's that the beginning of?
Advent.
Yeah, it's supposed to be the beginning of Advent. You notice that it changes. Why does it change every year?
Lunar.
It's based on a lunar calendar, right? And we've got a fixed calendar. By the way, that's why, guess who uses lunar calendar versus us who don't quite use lunar calendar? Well, the Hebrews do, but who else does? Greek Orthodox use the lunar calendar. And that's why their Easter aligns generally with Passover.
And their Christmas was just last
Yesterday.
week or
It
something.
was yesterday.
Yeah. They use the lunar dates. They use the lunar calendar, which we don't use. So, and what you'll do is you'll find that Rosh Hashanah varies quite broadly, but when the church set up the calendar, they set up Advent to be at the first of the Jewish year, basically. But, okay, I go back to it. How hard is it to figure out what day it is? I didn't leave it on here for you, but it's like the 5,000th something day of the Jewish year, or 5,000th Jewish year, or something like that, okay? Well, whose year are we using? Julius, right? Julian calendar. We don't use a Gregorian calendar. We use, and by the way, if you go on Wikipedia and look up dates, they'll give it to you in Gregorian, Julian. There's other ones too. You can have Sihedral. You can have what's the Sihedral dates? You can have
Manufacturing days.
you have lunar dates. I don't know manufacturer dates, but My point is simply this: we assume everybody uses what?
The same calendar.
Same time, same months, same everything. Just look at these. These are the months that are used. Now, in Israel, you go there and you'll find out they're in, January, February, March, April, May. But if you're using actual Hebrew months, they're lunar months. And by the way, most of these guys don't know how to correct for leap year, that odd, quarter of a day that we get every year that we have to correct. Okay? Do you think it kind of takes an advanced culture to be able to figure that one out? Yeah? Do you have a question?
I was just wondering how much of our calendar was driven by commerce,
Huh.
any of it.
All right. I don't have any penchant for Marxian theory. Marx says that what drives economics? Everything! That's basically Marx says everything is driven by economics, period, dot. Everything. Okay, which maybe is not a bad basis for philosophy. The only problem is he went wackadoodle. But, the real thing is that what makes you become numerically based in your culture? Economics. What makes you use time? Economics. Now, the bad thing is, where did the time basis come from economics? All earthly economics came from what? This is something they should have taught you in 6th grade. This is really important stuff. All right, let me ask you this way. Every single note, early papyrus text, the most earliest text we have in papyrus, okay, in anything, even in stone, what are they?
Receipts, bills?
They're receipts. They're receipts from the temple priests to the king for oxen and food. Why? What is so important?
Sacrifices, and tithes and things like that.
The sacrifice and tithes, because what happened? Okay, the king says, hey, I sent you 10 sheep. And somehow a couple of those sheep disappeared on the way, right? And the priests say, hey, our God is mad. Ra is angry because you didn't send us the 10 sheep you promised. And the king says, well, I sent you 10 sheep. See? So immediately what you need is a receipt. Because remember, what's the most important thing in commerce in the ancient world?
Religion.
The religion, the commerce with the gods. And that's why you find, the development of Zoroastrianism for basically the sacrifices in Babylonia were based in time. That's why you have base 60. Because you got a priest, you have the merchant, and you have the person interacting. So you have 3 people interacting. In the ancient Hebrew world, do you notice where they were going? Shepherds keeping their flocks by night who happened to be Levites that were looking after the Passover lambs. How many people are you going to have in that commerce?
A lot.
And guess who Jesus kicked out of the temple?
Money changers.
And they weren't really money changers. You know who they were? Well, they were money changers because what they had to do is they had to change your money to what kind of money?
Money on the rail.
Temple money. Temple money. So that you could put the appropriate money into the temple, right? But the big deal wasn't the money change. Well, there were money changers, but who else were there? Remember, Jesus cleans the temple in John 3 times when he was there. For the 3 times for the Passover. Why? What were they selling?
Sacrifices.
They're selling the lambs. And they were selling them, according to Josephus, at a higher price because why?
Demand.
They were perfect.
Oh.
Well, and the only person who could sell them was who? Because the priests are selling the lambs. The lambs had to be without spot or blemish. Well, who determines whether they're without spot or blemish?
The priest.
The priest. And so
Monopoly.
they got a monopoly.